It's a pleasure to welcome back Shulie after we missed last week, of course, because of Purim. So, and this series will have, I think, 2 more classes, and then she'll be giving a class on Pesach in a couple of weeks at the regular time slot, but a special archaeology and Pesach class. And as many of you know, I think many of your other classes, our other Pesach classes have started. Zev left them on the history class on Monday morning, 2 classes on Monday, our Murmusin on Wednesday, and Menachem Leibtag will be starting soon his Pesach class. So we do look forward to learning with you. Avram Kowalski's class on Pesach, very fascinating class we had on Monday. So please join if you haven't registered already. And as you notice, of course, we've changed the links for all the passwords. If you didn't notice, you wouldn't be here. So thank you for that. Tonight's Parsha Shir, actually, it is a slight change. The scheduled speaker, or whatever, is not feeling well, but thank God, Rav Yitzchak at Shalom is going to pinch hit. And so that'll be at 8:30 this evening from California, and an expert on Tanakh. He's spoken, not for a number of months, but has spoken in the past. So that's tonight at 8:30. And tomorrow morning, my regular Shir on the Sidur at 9 a.m. And everybody's welcome to Aller Shirm. And as I say, invite a friend. I guess I'm making the announcements now, Shulie, because you'll have to end it for us. So this way, you have an extra minute you can add to the class at the end.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. Vakasha, Shulie, it's all yours.
Okay, hi everybody. So we are heading into the home stretch of our Tanakh course. Who knows? Maybe we'll come back and do a replay or something else. But today we are going to do our last Melachim story, and next time so that we don't end on the very depressing Churban stories, next time we're going to have a peek into Shivat Zion, right, into the return to Zion, coming back, the last prophets, Ezra, Nehemiah. But today we are in the very sad end of First Temple times. This is a time period we're going to see. We did a little of this last time in the timeline of Malachim, but we're going to go back and take a look at a specific timeline of these last 120 years. These are very, very turbulent times, not just in Am Yisrael, but in our little world here, right? I won't say the whole world, but certainly in the ancient Near Eastern world, empires are rising and falling. The kingdom of Israel comes to an end. I'm just going to remind Rabbi Kalman to put the sources in the chat. Yes.
I remembered. They're there. I was just waiting for more
excellent.
people.
I didn't see them. Now I see them here. Okay, beautiful. So this is a dramatic time period. The kingdom of Israel comes to an end. Kingdoms rise and fall. Where is the kingdom of Judah in all of this? Where do they fit in? As we're going to see, there is one final good king, King Josiah, Yoshiyahu. After that, the kings are either evil or weak. We really don't have anybody very impressive. We have strong prophets. We have strong Nevi'im, right? Miyahu, Yechezkel, Yeshayahu at the beginning of the period. But how much are the people actually connecting to them, listening to them, having the courage to listen to them? So we're going to try to take a look at these very big pictures over the next hour. One thing that's very positive in terms of the story is not a positive story, but in terms of history and archaeology and Tanakh studies, we have a lot more archaeology from this late time period than we do from, let's say, the time of David or the time of the Shoftim for sure. So I just brought you an example here of some boule, right? Seal impressions, right? We know anybody who's important in ancient times has a signet ring, right? We just finished Purim. Hashverosh has Tabat HaMelech, and that's how he hands over power to Haman and then to Mordechai, because when you stamp your seal into the clay, that shows that it's an official document. But not only kings and their advisors had signet rings, but business people and some women, by the way. And we find a lot of these seals, not only in Israel, obviously, but in Israel, the ones that are interesting to us because we have names often from Tanakh, right? Not often, but we have many Tanakh-like names, let's put it that way. And then we have some actual names of people who we know of from Tanakh. So we're going to see a little bit later, we're going to have somebody really famous. These guys here are not particularly famous. Well, this is only one one here. Okay, but if you know your Sefer Yirmiyahu back and forth, they may sound familiar. This is one of two bule, two seal impressions found in the city of David. One says Yehochal ben Shlemya, and the other is Gedaliahu ben Pashhur. Hey, if you don't know those names, don't feel bad. But they are two of the not so nice advisors to the last king of Yudah, to Tzidkiyahu, and they are the ones who basically, they are among others, are the ones who say throw Yirmiyahu in the pit. They don't like what Yirmiyahu is saying, and it's kind of neat to get a little bit of a hello from them to find their seal impressions in Ir David. So we're going to see other artifacts as well, and this is a time where we really do have more archaeology, as opposed to next time, by the way, Shivat Sion in the Persian period, where we have very little. Okay, don't get freaked out by this timeline. It is a very long timeline. We're not going to go through every detail of it. The whole story of the Assyrians we did last time, so I'm just kind of refreshing your memory here. What we're going to really start with is Yirmiyahu, all right, Yirmiyahu and Yoshiyahu. But let's just get a little bit of a review, a quick review. We have the story of the Assyrians, right? The very powerful empire of the Assyrians, who eventually are not satisfied with only their area, but come to conquer other areas, including the kingdom of Israel. Starting in 734, Tiglath-Pileser comes and conquers the north of Israel. Okay, 12 years later, we have the rest of the kingdom of Israel, Shomron, conquered by Shalmaneser V and Sargon II. This is the end of the story of Malchut Yisrael, right? Officially, we have the 10 lost tribes. What happens to them? That's a subject for a very different Zoom. But the kingdom of Israel as an official entity is ended. And we talked last time about how devastating this is and how disturbing, not obviously to the people of the kingdom of Israel, but also to the people of the kingdom of Judah. How suddenly 5/6 of the people are gone. They're disappeared. They're exiled. We never hear about them again. Right? Later on, the Assyrians continue on towards Yehudah. They subjugate Yehudah. Chizkiyahu, the king of Yudah, the righteous king of Yudah, originally pays tribute and then rebels. And then, of course, we have the dramatic story of Sancheriv, who conquers most of Yehudah, including Lachish, besieges Yerushalayim, but does not conquer it. And we mentioned last time how significant a story this is, how big an impact it has, and how it's talked about in Tanakh in at least 3 places, right? We have versions of the story of Malachim in Divrei Hayamim and in Yeshayahu, plus perhaps some mention of it in Sefer Tehillim and in the book of Micha, right? It really is a very, very important story. But Jerusalem lives to see another day, and perhaps gets false hope that it will never be conquered. Okay? And that's where we're going to pick up our story. Okay, so we are going to hear about Yirmiyahu, the last real prophet of Yehudah. We have Yechezkel, but he's in a different place. We're going to mention him as well. The very significant moment where the Assyrian Empire falls, the Babylonian Empire wants to take its place in 612, and then Nineveh is going to be destroyed. And that's the backdrop for the story of Yoshiyahu, of Josiah. Okay, we're going to talk about that. And then we have these kind of shifting alliances. There's a vacuum of power. Who's going to take over? Is it going to be Egypt? Is it going to be the Babylonians? Who do we depend on? What do we do? Who's going to be the next power? Who do we trust? And we get echoes of this throughout the books of Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu. You're depending on, right, these shaky reeds that are not really going to hold you, that are not really going to be helpful to you. Hey, what kind of allies do you have? Very questions that are still very applicable today, right? Is NATO going to help you? Is the US going to throw you to the wolves? How's it going to work? Who's going to really defend and support you? And of course, the prophets come along and they say, you can't trust any of these humans. You have to trust only in God, which is a very beautiful message, but not a very easy message to follow, right, in the real world, in real politics. So we see back and forth, right? First, Judah is under the rule of Egypt. Then Egypt is defeated. Judah is slightly independent. Then Babylonia comes. Then we have a rebellion against Babylonia. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Okay. But in 597, You have the beginnings of the end. You have what's called Galut Yehoyachin or Galut HaCharash VaHamasger. We're going to talk about that, the first exile, okay? And 11 years later, after the last king of Judah, Tzidkiyahu, rebels against Babylonia in 586, you have the second exile, right? You have Nebuchadnezzar, the story that we all know, conquering Jerusalem, destroying the temple. It's still not the end of the story because we have the story of Gedaliah. Okay, Gedaliah is assassinated. That's still not the end of the story, as we're going to see. And then the return, of course, with King Cyrus. Okay, so it is, as you can see, 200 years that are jam-packed, that are just, in a sense, too full of events, right? We have the Chinese curse. May you be cursed to live in interesting times. These are very interesting times. In case you're confused about your kings, don't worry. Most people are confused about the kings, especially because a lot of their names are similar. One thing you don't have to worry about anymore, tragically, is you don't have the kings of Israel simultaneously with the kings of Judah, but we only have to worry about the kings of Judah. So just to get their names kind of in our heads a little bit, we're not going to be talking about all of them, but here's our dynasty, right? We have Achaz, Chizkiyahu, righteous king, right? Achaz, sort of not so terrible, but not particularly righteous. Chizkiyahu is one of the real righteous kings, right? The Gemara talks about how Chizkiyahu should have been the Mashiach. Then we have Menashe, who on the one hand rules for a very long time, on the other hand is the diametrical opposite of his father, right? Interesting psychology going on there, where Chizkiyahu does this huge religious reform, gets rid of all the idolatry, and along comes Menashe and brings it all back with a vengeance, right? And there's terrible idolatry in the time of Menashe. There's the possibility that the Torah is to a certain extent forgotten. We're going to talk about the discovery of the Torah in the time of Yoshiyahu, right? Perhaps because of Menashe and what he does, right? Menashe's son, who rules for a very short time. And then we have Yoshiyahu, Josiah, who comes to power at a very young age. His father dies very quickly. Yoshiyahu becomes king he's only 8 years old. But he is our last righteous king of Judah. After him, we're going to have 3 sons of Yoshiyahu, as well as a grandson. Okay, you have Yehoachaz ben Yoshiyahu, Yehoyakim ben Yoshiyahu, and Tzidkiyahu ben Yoshiyahu, and in between, for a very, very, very short time, Yehoyachin, who's the Galut Yehoyachin, right? They are very confusing. They do have similar names, but they are all basically bad guys, right? That's what's their common factor, except for Tzidkiyahu, you might be able to say he's not so bad. He's kind of very weak, right? Weak as opposed to bad. Okay, so that's our kings. Our prophets, there's a lot of prophets in this time, a lot of simultaneous prophets, interesting with different messages, sometimes with similar messages, okay? Throughout the time of Chizkiyahu, a little bit earlier, a little bit later, is Yeshayahu, one of the most powerful prophets. His message, right, his basic message, am I enabling this? I'm enabling this. Okay, his basic message is, if you don't like to see the transcript, you can just click it off. I think. Right, Rabbi Kalman, or did I just mess something up? I don't know. I'll let you worry about that since you're still here. Okay, his basic message, Yeshayahu, among many other messages, right? We have all the Nivuot Nechama, the comforting prophecies, but he says, don't trust in anybody, right? Don't trust in Egypt or Babylonia or Assyria. Trust in God. Don't make any false alliances. God is going to save you. Okay. He has contemporaries, Amos, Micha, Hosea, some of whom are similar to his messages, some of whom are slightly different, right? Amos focuses a lot on social justice. Okay. The next kind of prophet group, okay, is Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu is obviously the most significant of them. We're going to talk a lot about Yirmiyahu. His basic message in the beginning, right, when he's starts his reign as a prophet, is the time of Yoshiyahu. There's still a little bit of hope, but eventually he changes the message of not Yeshayahu's message of trust only in Hashem, but it's too late, right? You have gone to a point of no return, and nothing is going to get better anymore, and you just have to submit to the will of God. And this is why Yirmiyahu is kind of a controversial and a very tragic prophet, because he doesn't give so much hope. He does have nivuot nechama, right? He does say you're going to return, but he basically says the Babylonians are here and there's nothing you can do about it. Tshuva is not going to help you. Atonement is not going to help you anymore. And that's a very disturbing message. And there are those who see Yirmiyahu in his time period as a traitor. Right here, you are connecting to the Babylonians, saying you should submit to the Babylonians. What kind of a message is that? So he's a very complicated character. We're going to talk about him. He has a few different contemporaries, primarily Huldah, who is one of the few prophetesses, and we're going to hear about her in the time of Yoshiyahu, and Yechezkel, who of course leaves earlier than Yirmiyahu, and he's in Babylonia as the destruction is happening in Jerusalem. The other guys I put into parentheses because we're not 100% sure that they of their time period, but Nahum at some point with the Assyrian fall, Habakkuk, Tzfania, these are the prophets of the end of Bayit Rishon. Okay, so now that you've got all those guys straight in your head, I'm sure you all do, right? Let us move on. Okay, empire is a little bit easier, right? The Assyrians we talked about last time. That's the picture that we have here on the left, with the smaller Assyrian Empire in dark green, the really large expanded Assyrian Empire at the end of its power in the bright green. And they reach their greatest height in the 7th century, and then they fall apart, right? Nineveh is destroyed in the year 605. The inheritors are the Babylonians, right? And that's what you see on the right here. And they also are able to expand. They don't last for so long. They're going to be taken over by the Persians. We'll talk about the Persians next time. But these are the great empires of Mesopotamia, of the land between the rivers, of the culture that Abraham wants to get away from. Okay, and we mentioned last time Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel talking about the importance of separating ourselves from these empires. Okay, so these empires are not only a political military threat, they are also a spiritual threat to Am Yisrael. So that's something else to keep in mind. Okay, just to bring us back, one last thing about the Assyrians, and then we're going to leave the Assyrians behind. As we said last time, Sancherib comes, conquers, Chizkiyahu rebels against him. Sancherib conquers all of Yehudah, essentially, with the biggest, splashiest conquest being in Lachish, right? And it's such a big deal that he memorializes it forever on his palace, on the palace relief that he has in Nineveh, this whole story of taking the siege of Lachish, the conquest of Lachish, bringing the captives back to Nineveh, right? And then he marches on Yerushalayim. And the story in Yerushalayim is the story that Tanakh really focuses on, where the representatives of the Assyrians speak to the guards on the wall, and it's very terrifying. And even Chizkiyahu is terrified. And Yeshayahu reassures him that God is going to save them. And then Tanakh tells us, "Vayakumu baboker v'hinei kulam pigarim metim," right? The Assyrian army drops dead, right? And we talked last time about how maybe it's just a spin of Tanakh, except that we have archaeological proof that the city was not destroyed. We don't have a destruction level from this time period, as opposed to 100 plus years later, where the Babylonians come, we do have a destruction level. Plus, we have this fascinating prism of Sancherib, where he talks about the siege, right? He says, Chizkiyahu, the king of Judah, I shut him up like a bird in the cage, but he doesn't say that he conquered him, right? And the allusion from Yeshayahu about birds, Kitsi Purim up like birds that fly. That was a very powerful, positive message we had last time. But I'm going to wreck that positive message a little bit, because one suggestion from the archaeology of the last 10 years is that the Assyrians may have not succeeded in conquering Jerusalem, but it's very likely that they didn't just turn around and go home, right? What did they do? They headed a couple of kilometers south to a place that today we call Ramat Rachel, okay, and the southern edge of Jerusalem. Kibbutz. It was founded in the 1920s, but there's a fascinating archaeological site there, a site that up until relatively recently, everybody assumed was a palace of the Judean kings. But the more we're excavating it, and we're going to talk about it next time as well with the Shivat Zion story, the more it seems that it was a palace of outsiders, right? Of people who were not Judean, right? And the suggestion is that this is an Assyrian outpost that becomes a Babylonian outpost that becomes a Persian outpost, that this is kind of the High Commissioner's palace of ancient times, right? The British mandate, they build this palace outside of the main part of the city to keep an eye on what's going on. The Assyrians stick around, they collect taxes, they collect tribute. This is one suggestion about what this site is. We'll talk more about the site later, but it's very possible that the Assyrians do not just kind of turn tail and are completely defeated, although they do leave the city of Jerusalem proper alone. Okay, so now let's start with our new stuff. Okay. And here we are in the time period that is after Chizkiyahu and after Menashe, right? And we have this new king, Josiah, Yoshiyahu. Okay? And Yoshiyahu comes along. Now, we know there was a religious reform in the time of Chizkiyahu. He gets rid, if I have a chance, I could mute everyone. Can I mute everyone? I don't want to mess anything up.
You know what? I'll reclaim host for a moment and then I'll
mute everyone. Mute everyone because I can't get to it from my screen sharing. Okay, so along comes Menashe, brings back with a vengeance the idolatry that was gone. And when we talk about idolatry, we're talking about a few things, right? We have outright idolatry, for sure. We have idols that are found all over the land of Israel in Israelite and Judahite sites. But we also have something that's called syncretism, right? It's a mixture of idolatry and serving God. And sometimes it's not even idolatry. Sometimes it's just the idea of having a temple or an altar that is away from Jerusalem, right? The idea is that you're supposed to have one place, hamakom, but people don't live all in one place, and people wanted local temples. So this religious reform encompasses a lot of things. It's getting rid of real idolatry, but it's also getting rid of temples that are a mixture of idolatry and of serving God. And it's also getting rid of things that may have been only for serving God. So along comes Yoshiyahu, and he is also filled with religious zeal, right? And he decides he's going to do a religious reform. This is precipitated by this amazing story that we have in the book of Kings, chapter 22, right? Where you have the Kohen, right? The Kohen Gadol Chilkiah says to the scribe Shaphan, I have found a scroll of the teaching in the house of the Lord. He finds a Sefer Torah, right? What is going on? Now, there are those who suggest that this is a new book. This is the book of Devarim, which was not, is not as old as tradition sees it, right? Torah Misinai, but rather it's written later and this is how it's presented to the people. But it's very possible that this is just a Torah scroll that is forgotten. And if you think that in the 50 years of Menashe's rule, how could it be possible that Torah could have been completely forgotten from the people? I invite you to speak to anybody who spent some decades in communist Russia, okay, or spoke to people who came out of communist Russia. Torah can be forgotten if there are no teachers, if it's forbidden to be taught. And it's very possible that it is forgotten by most of the people, maybe a few underground people here and there. But in any case, there's this scroll and they read it and they're very upset because this is telling things that you're not allowed to do that they've been doing. And what do we do about this? And Chilkiah gave the scribe to Shaphan. I'm now reading in the text. And Shaphan read it to the king. When the king heard the words of the scroll of the teaching, he rent his clothes and he said, go inquire of the Lord. Now, here's where something that's fascinating happens, right? Where do they go? Look down about a third of the way down. So the priest Chilkiah and Achikam, Achbor, Shaphan, Asariah, right? We have this whole entourage. Who do they go to? They go to the prophetess Huldah, who was living in Jerusalem in the Mishneh, and they spoke to her. And the rabbis asked the question, right? Well, you have Jeremiah, right? You have your Miyahu. Why are you going to Huldah, right? Women's rights, all very nice, but it seems a little strange. And the answer that they give is they thought that as a woman, she would be gentler. She would be more merciful. Is this true? I don't know. But they end up going to Huldah, who is a Nevi'ah, living in Jerusalem. And she gives them what God says, right? Thus says, Lord, say the man who sent this to me, I am going to bring disaster upon this place in accordance with the words of the scroll, because they have forsaken me. My wrath is kindled from this place. As for the words of you have heard, because your heart was softened and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I decreed, that will become a desolation and a curse. I, for my part, have listened, declares the Lord. So the punishment is at least pushed off. Okay, but Yoshiyahu takes this as a sign to do a purge of all of these illicit temples, gods, altars, right? And we actually have a fascinating evidence of this. I saw somebody wrote in the chat, was very excited. I didn't see who it was. This is the temple in Arad, right? And the temple in Arad is one of the coolest places in Israel. No one goes there, but it's really cool. Arad is, of course, in the Negev. It's a kind of a border city, right? You could say there are places that are further south than Arad, but basically civilized habitation ended at the line of Beersheba and Arad. After that, it's desert. Nobody's living down there. So Beersheba and Arad in Tanakh times are border cities. And we have a fortress in Arad, and we have a fortress city in Beersheba where soldiers are defending the border. And in both Beersheba and Arad, we find evidence of local worship. Okay, in Beersheba and Tel Sheva, more accurately, we find an altar that was actually put into Geniza. It was dismantled and put into a basement in the time of Chizkiyahu's religious reform, because the king's supervisors come, they knock at the gates. Hello, we're here from orders of the king. We want you to get rid of all of your idolatry and your altars and your temples and blah, blah, blah. We'll be back in a month to check, right? And the people don't want to destroy it because it's holy to them, but the king's supervisor is going to come back and check. So they take it apart and they put it in Geniza. They put it in a basement. Okay. In Arad, what happens, and this is not in the time of Chizkiyahu, but in the time of Yoshiyahu, right? Josiah, they come, and not only do they find an altar, they find an entire temple. And it's wild because it really gives us a sense of this is like a mini version of the temple in Jerusalem. It's the same layout. There's a courtyard. There's an altar, right? An altar that's made the way you're supposed to make it, out of field stones, not hewn stones like the one in Beersheba. Okay. And then there's a further place, and that's what you see in here, where you go a little bit further in, and there's what we would call the Kodesh, the holy, right? The holy, and then the Holy of Holies with an incense altar in the holy, right? Very similar to what you have in the Mikdash itself. And it was put into Geniza. It was just completely buried underground to be found by archaeologists centuries upon centuries later. Okay, so this is what Josiah does. He institutes this religious reform, gets rid of all the idolatry. Okay, and what's the next step? Now that he has become righteous, like his great grandfather, now he says, okay, the time has now come to bring back the 10 tribes, to reclaim the kingdom of Israel. And this is where he goes too far, and he falls to that great Greek sin, hubris, right? He thinks, again, I'm a righteous king. Everything is going to be okay. And so what does he do? He needs to take back, to reclaim the kingdom of Israel. Now, if you remember back to the timeline, this is a time where things are a little bit in flux, right? The Assyrian Empire has fallen or is falling, but the Babylonians haven't quite stepped in yet. Who's going to take over? Who's going to be the next great power? Egypt wants to be the next great power, but Josiah says, no, I'm going to be the next great power. And that way I'm going to reclaim the kingdom of Israel. And so what does he do? Okay, we have a little bit of the story in Sefer Melachim, more in Divrei Hayamim, in Chronicles. He goes up north to this very significant crossroad site, right? Megiddo, remember Armageddon, the place of all the wars and the battles. And he goes up to stop the king of Egypt, Paro Necho. Okay, Paro Necho, who's on his way north to fight in Carchemish to defeat the Assyrians, to be the heir to the Assyrian Empire. And Josiah comes and says, no, it's not going to be you. It's going to be me. And listen to the exchange between them, because it's fascinating, right? After all this furbishing of the temple by Josiah, King Necho, Paro Necho of Egypt, came up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. Now, Paro Necho doesn't want to be distracted by this little Judean king. Necho sent messengers to him, saying, "What have I to do with you, King of Judah? I do not march against you this day, but against the kingdom that wars with me, and is God's will that I hurry. Refrain them from interfering with God who is with me, that he not destroy you. You little pisher, go home. Leave me alone. Don't stick your head between these two great empires. You have nothing to do here." But Josiah would not let him alone. Instead, he donned his armor to fight him, heedless of Necho's words from the mouth of God, right? The book is telling you here that what Paro Necho says, he thinks he's saying his words, but it's really God's words. And he came to fight him in the plain of Megiddo. Archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, "Get me away from here. I am badly wounded." His servants carried him out of his chariot and conveyed him to Jerusalem, and he died and was buried in the grave of his fathers. And all Judah and Jerusalem went into mourning over Josiah. Jeremiah composed laments for Josiah, right? The Kina of Yirmiyahu, Kinat Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu. Okay, they became customary in Israel and were incorporated into the laments. So first of all, what is that? Some suggest that this is the third chapter of Echa, by the way, that this is the lament, right? The Gever, right? The lament about the Gever. The Gever is Yoshiyahu. But beyond that, it's significant for us to understand that this is a terrible, terrible moment. Okay, this is the end. This is the beginning of the end. Yoshiyahu is the final righteous king. Here he is defeated in a completely avoidable battle. And from that point on, nothing is going to be good anymore. And Yirmiyahu, who is a young prophet, right, he understands that any hope that they might have had is now finished, right, has now come to an end. And now we come to the story of Yirmiyahu. Right, Yirmiyahu, I will say personally that Yirmiyahu is my favorite Navi. And I think for many people, he's their favorite Navi because he is a very tragic figure. He's also the most personal of all the Nevi'im. We learn about his life. We hear about his troubles and how much he's torn and how terrible his situation is, because he's basically in a very impossible situation. He has to come to the people and tell them only bad news, and they don't want to hear bad news. And so he's in perpetual mourning, even when things don't look so bad. He has to mourn with the people, but he also has to rebuke them. And he feels the destruction in a very, very personal way, right? You feel it in the prophecies that he have. You feel it in how Chazal relate to him as well, right? There's this incredible midrash where Yirmiyahu is walking and the Churban has happened, and he's walking and he's crying and he's screaming and he's tearing his clothes, and he sees this woman who's also screaming and crying and tearing her clothes, and he says, "Well, why are you crying?" Right? And she says, "Why are you crying?" And she tells him about all her sons who have been killed. And ultimately, it turns out that she is the personification of Jerusalem, right? They're both crying over the same thing. So Yirmiyahu has this very, very difficult job of rebuking, but yet mourning with the people as well. And we know a lot about Yirmiyahu's life, right? We have the beginning of his book, right? The introduction tells us who he is, right? The words of Yirmiyahu, the son of Hilkiah, one of the priests at Anatot. Remember Hilkiah from Josiah, right? That's his father. One of the priests at Anatot in the territory of Binyamin. So already just in that, we have so much, right? He is a Kohen. He's coming from Anatot. We're going to see why that's important. He's coming from Binyamin. This is a picture of the Palestinian town of Anata, which is right near the Jewish new community of Anatot, but Anata is the real Anatot, right? It's on the edge of the desert, right? Yirmiyahu talks a lot about water and about desert because he grows up and he lives on what's called the frontier, the Sfar Hamidbar, the edge of the desert, where water is a very precious commodity, and he's very familiar with the desert. He doesn't live in Jerusalem proper. Anatot is very much a part of his identity. He has to buy land there to show Hashem's promise that they're going to return, right? He goes back there. The territory of Binyamin is very much a part of him, right? So his landscape, as we're going to see, is very significant, okay? And then we hear about when he prophesies, right? The words of the Lord came to him in the days of Josiah in the 13th year of his reign, right? So he starts his career as we said, at this hopeful moment, right, when Josiah starts out doing these reforms. But then he continues on through the terrible days of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, until the end of the 11th year of King Tzidkiyahu, when Jerusalem went into exile in the 5th month, right? So he has a long career and a very, very difficult career. The story of Anatot is a very interesting story. We have the house of Eli, right? Remember the house of Eli in Sefer Shmuel, and Eli, who is the high priest, is ultimately cursed by God because his sons go astray. They don't follow what God wants them to do, and Eli is cursed that his line is not going to continue. Now it takes a while until that prophecy is fulfilled. It happens in the time of King Solomon, right at the beginning of the Book of Kings, right? We have the people who had followed Adoniah when Adoniah wants to become king and he doesn't become king, and then Shlomo gets rid of all of those followers. Now the Kohen Evyatar, he can't kill him, he's a Kohen. So what does he say to him? The priest Evyatar, the king said, go to your estate at Anatot. You deserve to die, but I shall not put you to death because you carry the ark of my Lord God before my father David. Okay, so Shlomo dismissed Evyatar. He sends him home, thus fulfilling what the Lord had spoken at Shiloh regarding the house of Eli. So Evyatar is a descendant. He's one of the few descendants of the house of Eli. They live in Anatot. Yirmiyahu is a Kohen who also lives in Anatot. The suggestion, this is Ze'ev Ehrlich's suggestion, that Yirmiyahu is a descendant of the house of Eli. And when he says in chapter 7, when he tells the people, you can't depend on God not destroying the temple, you deserve it, and God's going to destroy the temple. And he says, if you don't think God is capable or willing to destroy the temple, he says, go to my place at Shiloh, L'chuna el mikomi asher b'Shiloh, where I had established my name formerly, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. Yirmiyahu grows up with the traditions of Shiloh because he's from the house of Eli, and the tradition of Shiloh is that Shiloh ultimately is destroyed, and God will destroy his house if it is necessary. Yirmiyahu says, you don't believe that's going to happen? It's going to happen. Just go back to Shiloh. So that's a fascinating connection. We don't know for sure that he's descended from the house of Eli, but I think it's a very interesting and a logical suggestion. Okay, so where is Anatot, right? Anatot is out in the desert. It's a city that is a city of Kohanim. Let's just find it here on our map. Okay, here is Anata. Okay, just east of Pisgat Ze'ev, right? So when you drive out of Jerusalem and you are heading towards the north, towards Beit El, towards Shiloh, right? If you, instead of doing that, you go on road 437 that takes you out to the east and out towards the Dead Sea, Ma'ale Adumim, and then the Dead Sea, you are passing by Anata. You're also passing by the Jewish community of Almon/Anatot. Okay, that's the new Jewish community that's named for the old community. But Anatot is actually very close to what is within the community of Almon, and that's Ein Prat. Okay, Ein Prat is an amazing spring that is the source water of what we call Wadi Kelt, okay, this massive riverbed that goes out to the Dead Sea. And Yirmiyahu is only about 5 kilometers away from this very great source water of Wadi Kelt, okay? And we hear about it in his prophecies, okay? We have a few different things. First of all, he has to go do a symbolic act at Wadi Kelt. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, but he also has this symbolism of the water, right? And if you've ever been here, and if you haven't been here, it's an incredibly beautiful place. There's a huge abundance of water, right? It's a spring, it's a flowing spring, it's very beautiful, there's tons of water, and Yirmiyahu sees this, and he says to himself, you know, a Navi also always looks around at his surroundings in order to convey his message, right? And he says, look at these people, right? Here we are, Yirmiyahu Perek my people have done a twofold wrong. They have forsaken me, the fount of living waters, Be'er Mayim Chayim, and hewed out broken cisterns which cannot even hold water, right? What's the metaphor? Of course, you're leaving God and you're going to the idols. But the mashal, right? The parable is you have this great source of water and you're not even willing to go down the hill and to take the water from here. You'd rather have cisterns that sometimes you have water, sometimes you don't. It's a very not sure thing. Why don't you just go to the source of the real living waters, right? Why don't you go back to God? Now we have Yirmiyahu, like many Nevi'im, has to perform symbolic acts, right? And symbolic acts are the social media of the ancient world, right? They're the way that you catch people's attention, that you make them listen to your message. Your message might not sound so exciting, but when you see somebody doing something very strange, then you might be more interested and you'll follow and your attention will be caught.
What?
So in Yirmiyahu, Perek Yudalit, okay, whoever is talking, please mute yourself. I'm sorry, I just don't want to go out of the share to mute you. God says to him, go buy a loincloth of linen and put it around your loins, but do not dip it into the water. Okay, what does that mean? So Ze'ev Erlich again gives a nice interpretation. It's not just that he has to go buy himself this thing to cover himself. He has to wear it, right? Here's this Navi, here's this respected, righteous figure, and he's walking around in the equivalent of very short shorts. Everybody's noticing that, right? Everybody's seeing that. So he does that. He walks around with it. And then what he has to do is he has to go hide it in the Prat. Now, Prat is the river, the Euphrates, but that's very, very far away. And it's much more likely that it's what we call here the Prat, Ein Prat, Nachal Prat, right? And very close to his home. And he has to go put it between the rocks, leave it there, and eventually come back and see what's happened to it and how it's been destroyed. And the message, of course, is that the people who were so close to God, like the cloth was close to Yirmiyahu's body, even though they were so close to God, eventually God can destroy them and get rid of them, just like the loincloth has been destroyed in the water. Right, but he's using his environment in order to give over the message. Okay, another piece of his environment is the desert. Yirmiyahu, other Nevi'im use it too, but Yirmiyahu often invokes the desert as a metaphor. Okay, it has two meanings. One is this kind of pristine place where the people of Israel followed God with blind faith. And that's this very famous phrase that we have at the very beginning, right? Haloch v'karata b'oznei Yerushalayim, right? I accounted to your favor the devotion of your youth. Zacharti lach chesed ne'urayich, ahavat klulotayich. Your love is a bride. Lechtech acharai b'midbar be'eretz lo zruah. How you followed me in the wilderness in a land not sown. That the Jewish people goes, they follow God out of Egypt. They go, they don't know where they're going, but just like the young bride is going to follow her husband wherever he's going to take her because she trusts him and she believes in him, so too here. And you went out into the desert. Okay, and that's one way of looking at the desert, as this place where God protects you, where you trust in God. Yirmiyahu also uses the desert as a place where you flee. It's a refuge, right? Oh, to be in the desert at an encampment for wayfarers, to leave my people, to go away from them, for they are all adulterers and a band of rogues. Now Yirmiyahu knows the desert very well. He's very familiar with it. He's a shepherd. He goes out to the desert, and therefore the metaphor makes a lot of sense. I'll just tell you very, very quickly a great story about this first quote here. Right, Menachem Begin, when he finally was taken out of the opposition and he was elected to be the prime minister, he spoke, of course, and one of the people that he thanked, one of the most important people that he thanked, was his wife Aliza, who stood by him throughout everything. And he says, "Zacharti lach chesed ne'urayich ahavat klulotayich." Right, he quotes Yirmiyahu. I remember the devotion of your youth. Lechtech acharai b'midbar. You followed me in the desert. Be'eretz zruat mokshim, not a land that was not sown, but a land that was sown with minefields, right? All of the things, all the problems that he had with the opposition, with everybody else, right? Eretz zruat mokshim. Just another short thing about Yirmiyahu and his language and his metaphors. Noga Haruveni, who was the creator of Neoktumim, of the Biblical Nature Reserve, he was one of the first people who did something that today everybody does, which is studying Tanakh with looking at the terrain, right? Today, everybody takes their Tanakh and they go on Tanakh Tiyulim, and they're out there bashetach, right? And they're going and they're learning about what everything is. But Nogar Reuveni was one of the very first to do that. And he wrote a book called A New Light on the Book of Jeremiah, or Chadash al Sefer Yirmiyahu. He wrote it in the 50s, where he said, there are a lot of things that you can really only understand when you know the terrain that the person is coming from. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. He points out that Yirmiyahu is almost the only prophet who is always in action, right? First of all, he wakes up early. Look here at Pasuk at Perak Zayin, right? Chapter 7. I brought you this for you in Hebrew because I wanted you to see the language. Daber elechem hashkem v'daber. God says, I spoke to you. Here the translation is persistently, but that's not a good translation. Hashkem v'daber means early. I got up early and I spoke to you, right? And Yirmiyahu is always getting up early. He's always hashkem ve. He also is haloch ve, right? Go and do this. Go and walk, right? Go to places. Why? Yirmiyahu, unlike Yeshayahu, does not live in the city of Jerusalem. Yirmiyahu lives in Anatot. Anatot is about a 2-hour walk, give or take, to Jerusalem, i.e. not Pisgat Ze'ev, right? But to Jerusalem, the old city, which is where people lived. In order for Yirmiyahu to be in the court of the temple at rush hour, right? At business hours, so that people can listen to him, he's got to wake up early. Because he's got to get there early. He's got to get there by whatever it is, 9, 10 o'clock. He's got to hashkem vidaber. He's got to wake up early. He's got to be haloch vidaber. He's got to be walking and thinking, right? And we get this incredible sense of Yirmiyahu, kind of everything is percolating in him as he's walking. And that's this Yirmiyahu chapter 20, verse 7. I'm going to read it to you first in Hebrew because the Hebrew is so beautiful. You can follow along in the English. Pititani Adonai ve'efpat, chizaktani vatuchal, haiti l'schok kol hayom kula la'agli. You enticed me, pititani, right? It's fascinating. It's a word that you use for seducing someone. You seduced me, God, and I was seduced. You overpowered me and you prevailed, right? What's the internal battle going on inside Yirmiyahu? I'm going to come and I'm going to say these things and everyone's going to laugh at me and they're going to say, what are you talking about? We're doing great. What do you mean surrender to the Babylonians? I'm going to be, everyone's going to laugh at me. And I can't do it. But God, you're tempting me. Right, and I'm going to read again the Hebrew. Ki midei adaber ezak chamas v'shod ekra ki hayad dvar Hashem li lecherpa ulecheles kol hayom va'amarti lo eskerenu v'lo adaber od bishmo. Right, everyone jeers at me every time I speak. I have to shout out lawlessness, but the word of the Lord causes me constant disgrace and contempt. And I said, I will not mention him. Lo eskerenu v'lo adaber od. He makes a vow. I'm not going to do it, God. You can't seduce me anymore. I'm not going to talk anymore about what you want me to talk, right? And he's walking along and he's saying this to himself. He's saying, I'm not doing it this time. You're not going to tempt me this time. But what's going on? V'haya libi ke'esh bo'eret atzur ba'atzmotai v'nil'eti kalkel v'lo uchal. His word was like a raging fire in my heart, shut up in my bones. I could not hold it in. I was helpless. It's an amazing description of the Navi, right? The Navi on the one hand is very human, right? He of course feels the jeers of the people. He doesn't want to be made fun of, but on the other hand, God's words are just burning inside him and he can't help it. He's got to say it. And it's all happening on that long walk that he's taking to Jerusalem. These different impulses are fighting inside him. So it's definitely one of the most powerful passages in the book of Yirmiyahu. One last thing that Nogar Reuveni brings in that he says, right? And again, I'll read it for you in the Hebrew as well, but Yirmiyahu 21, right at the end, he says, Hineni elecha yoshevet ha'emek tzur hamishor. I will deal with you, inhabitants of the valley, rock of the plain. Okay, now he's talking about Jerusalem. And biblical commentaries, right, academic scholars in the 19th century, they read this and they said, Yoshevet ha'emek, inhabitant of the valley. Jerusalem's on the valley, Jerusalem's on the mountain. This must be wrong. And they amended the text and they said, no, it's the inhabitants of the mountains, not of the valley. But Nogar Reuveni says, no. When you are coming from Anatot, from Pisgat Ze'ev area, how do you get to Jerusalem? You're coming along the ridge of Mount Scopus. And that's the view that you have here. You're standing on Mount Scopus and you're looking down at Jerusalem. Jerusalem is in the valley because it's lower than Mount Scopus. And Yirmiyahu is approaching from the northeast. When he sees Jerusalem, Jerusalem is in the valley. So it's a great example of understanding the terrain in order to understand the text. Okay, so Yirmiyahu has to deal with various kings, the most pernicious of which is Jehoiakim. Okay, Jehoiakim rules for the longest, and he is evil on various levels, right? And this is often what happens in Tanakh, that a king is evil not only because he is an idol worshiper, but also because he does not do the job of a king, which is to protect his people. Right? And Yirmiyahu has this very powerful passage, chapter 22, right? He who builds his house with unfairness and his upper chambers with injustice, who makes his fellow man work without pay and does not give him his wages, who thinks, I will build me a vast palace with spacious upper chambers, provided with windows, paneled in cedar, painted with vermilion. Do you think you are more a king because you compete in cedar? Your father ate and drank. Remember, his father is Josiah, the righteous king, and dispensed justice and equity. All went well with him. He upheld the rights of the poor and the needy. All was well. Yoakim, you're so worried about your image and how you look in the eyes of the people that you are going to go and take the people's hard-earned money and their labor in a time of enormous upheaval and spend that on your palace and on building yourself a fabulous palace. Now, one of the first excavators of the site in Ramat Rachel that we mentioned earlier, okay, found this amazing compound, which had clearly stuff that was built on a very high level. This was Yochanan Aharoni, one of the deans of early Israeli biblical archaeology. And he found these beautiful hewn stones and these proto-Aeolic columns and these beautiful windowsills. And Yochanan Aharoni, of course, knew his Tanakh backwards and forwards. And he says, who built this, right? Who built his windows, provided with windows? Who had, and he found on the stone little traces of red paint, painted with vermilion. This is clearly Jehoiakim's palace. Okay? And he goes and he presents, there was a tradition in the early years of the state, it's come back since then, of the president, prime minister and the president having Bible classes in the president's house. And he comes and he presents this chapter of Jeremiah and he presents his findings. And he says, Hoi boneh beito b'lo tzedek. This is Jehoiakim's palace. Is it really Jehoiakim's palace? Maybe, maybe not. But the presentation is a very powerful one. Now, Jehoiakim doesn't just scorn the word of God, scorn social justice and how to treat people. He also scorns the word of God, and he also doesn't listen. And we have this incredible story where Jeremiah, who's by now persona non grata, right? He really can't show up in the temple, in the royal palace, anywhere, because he's saying, he's preaching surrender to Babylonia, and the temple is going to be destroyed, and nobody wants him there, and he'll be in great danger if he goes there. So he sends his scribe Baruch ben Neriah, and Baruch ben Neriah comes and he reads out these very shocking words. Right? It doesn't say here what he reads, but we think it's the prophecy that talks about how God's going to destroy the temple. And there are a few good people in Jehoiakim's cabinet. And one of them is Michaiah, the son of Gemariahu, the son of Shaphan. We're going to talk about Gedaliah at the end, right? He's in the same family. And he heard the words of the Lord from the scroll, and he went down to the king's palace, and everybody's very shocked, right, by these prophecies. And they say, okay, bring this guy, right? Bring his scroll. He needs to read to the king. Right, so he reads first to the cabinet officials, the scribe, everybody else. They say, we must report to the king. Go into hiding, you and Jeremiah. Let no man know where you are. And they go to the king, okay, and they report these matters to the king, and they bring the scroll, right, and listen to what the king does. Yehudi read it to the king and all the officials who were in attendance on the king. Now, it was the 9th month. Now, if you know your months, you know the first month is Tanakh is Nisan, the 7th month is Tishrei, the 9th month is Kislev. Kislev is a cold month. Okay? The king was sitting in the winter house with a fire burning in the brazier before him. This is an irrelevant detail. No. Every time Yehudi read 3 or 4 columns, the king would cut it up with a scribe's knife and throw it into the fire until all the scroll was consumed by the fire in the brazier. And the king and his courtiers who heard all these words showed no fear and did not tear their garments. Okay, nobody is afraid. Nobody cares. This is the word of God. We're not listening. We're not even not listening. We're throwing it into the fire. I told you before that we found a seal of a very famous individual. This is the seal that was found in the city of David about 40 years ago. And it says on it, Miyahu ben Shaphan. Miyahu ben Shaphan, the father of Michaiah, the scribe of King Jehoiakim, one of the few righteous people in Jehoiakim's government. Everybody disdains the words of God, okay? And there's a rebellion, and the Babylonians show up. Jehoiakim dies. Jehoiachin, okay? Jehoiakim's son becomes king, but for a very, very, very short time. And then we have this first exile, right? 597, 11 years before the destruction of the temple. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia advanced against the city. King Jehoiachin of Yudah, along with his mother and his courtiers, surrendered to the king. The king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. He carried from Jerusalem all the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the royal palace, and he exiled all of Jerusalem, as well, listen to the end of this verse, as all the craftsmen and the smiths. Only the poorest people in the land were left. In Hebrew, this is called Galut Yehoiachin, the exile of Yehoiachin, but it's also called Galut HaCharash v'Hamazger, the craftsmen and the smiths, right? All of the people who were kind of useful in any way, right, who are the real engines of the economy, they're deported. They're sent to Babylonia. Only the poor people are left behind. And we actually have fascinating archaeological evidence of this in recent years when the back of the Kotel Plaza has been excavated. So there's a huge new building going up over it, but they excavated the back of the plaza and they found a bunch of fascinating things from Second Temple times to Byzantine times, but they found a large house, a 4-room house, okay, architecture of biblical times, okay, but on a very large scale, right near the Temple Mount, right near where the government offices might have been. And what was fascinating about this house is that it was essentially empty. Okay, it was destroyed, but usually when houses are destroyed, you find underneath the roof all the stuff, right? Everything's burnt. You find pottery. Sometimes you'll find people's bones. There was almost nothing in this house. And which leads us to believe that this is one of these cabinet ministers, one of these important people who actually packed up and left. The house was only destroyed 11 years later in the destruction of the temple, okay? But the house was emptied out already in 597. They packed their bags, they went to Babylonia. They found a seal here, right? The seal of an archer, okay? A symbol of the city. The first exile happens, okay? And then we have what I call here a split screen. You have a prophet that goes with this exile, and that's the prophet Ezekiel, Yechezkel, and you have the prophet that stays behind, Miyahu. And for these 11 years, you have a community and a prophet in Babylonia. You have a community and a prophet in Jerusalem, and they're each dealing with different things, right? Yechezkel is is very harshly rebuking the Jews of Jerusalem while he's kind of, holding down the fort for these exiles in Babylonia. But when he hears about the destruction of the temple, his tone changes and he becomes very comforting. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Jeremiah has to give his message, which is surrender to the Babylonians, submit to the will of God. And I'll just read you one thing here. We won't read the whole Yirmiyahu 21, where he just says surrender, but Yechezkel 11 is very interesting because he's showing the two sides of the story, right? Oh, mortal, Ben Adam, right? That's the catchphrase of Yechezkel. Achecha, achecha, right? Your brothers, the men of your kingdom of the very house of Israel, to whom the inhabitants of Jerusalem say, keep far from the Lord. The land has been given as a heritage to us. Okay, this is something we're going to talk about next time. The conflict between the people who stayed behind and the people who went into exile. The people who stayed behind said, you guys, that's it, you're done. You're You're off of the pages of Jewish history. You've left the land of Israel, and you're not important anymore. Only the people in the land of Israel are important. And Yechezkel says to them, no, no, no. Thus said the Lord God, I have indeed removed them from among the nations and scattered them among the countries, and I have become to them a diminished sanctity, mikdash ma'at, right? The word that we use today for a synagogue in the countries where they have gone. But I will gather you from the people and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered and give you the land of Israel. Yechezkel says, don't worry. You're going to stay together. You're going to remain a people. You're going to eventually come back. And this story is something we're going to talk about next time. The artifact that we have here is actually it's a Babylonian tablet that talks about rations that are given to King Jehoiakim and eating at the royal table, right? It's fascinating testimony to Jehoiachin being in Babylonia. Okay, since Rabbi Kalman told me I have an extra 1 minute, we will finish up with the story of the destructions. Okay, the battles, the Babylonians come and they see that this first exile is not enough. King Zedekiah rebels against the Babylonians, and Nebuchadnezzar comes with his army and attacks. Again, an attack at Lachish. The same Lachish that the Assyrians attacked is rebuilt and is attacked by Nebuchadnezzar. And in the book of Jeremiah, it's one of the last fortresses. The fortresses on the western frontier of the land of Israel fall one after the other. And the book of Jeremiah, it says the remaining towns of Judah, Lachish and Azekah. Now, this is fascinating because when Lachish was excavated in the 1930s, in the gate of the city, they found what are called the Lachish letters, okay? These pieces of pottery that have writing on them that seem to be written from some commander at one of the other Judean fortresses and sent to Lachish. And the most famous one is letter number 4, right? Where the author says, you should know that the signals station, we are watching the signal stations of Lachish because we do not see the signals of Azekah. The lights have already gone out in Azekah. That fortress has been conquered. Lachish, you're the last one standing and we're watching you. Where is this guy watching from? That's a very interesting question that we will not go into, but it's the same 2 last towns, Lachish and Azekah, that Miyahu writes about, the Lachish letters write about. This is an eyewitness account. The Babylonians arrive in Jerusalem. We have evidence of the attacks, the battles at the Israelite Tower, okay, in the northwestern part of the city, and what's the Jewish quarter of today. We have massive fire and arrowheads that are discovered in the southern part of the city, in the city of David, and we have a clear conquest. We have evidence of Nebuchadnezzar. This is from the Ishtar Gate in Babylonia over here on the right, but on the left you have the fortress, the Israelite Tower, and the conquest of the city from the north. Meanwhile, King Tzidkiyahu tries to escape. Okay, and we have testimony about this in the book of Jeremiah, how he leaves the city. He runs away. He heads out towards the east, towards Jericho, but the Babylonian soldiers capture him. They kill his children. They blind him. It's a very, very terrible story. There's a massive cave in the northern part of Jerusalem called Tzidkiyahu's Cave. It's already known about in the time of the Gemara. It's a huge cave. And the Midrash says this is the cave that Tzidkiyahu escapes out of. Only the slight problem with this is that the cave is a dead end. Okay, you come in near what today is Shar Shem, and you go deep under the city to like deep underneath the Muslim quarter. It does not take you out to the Arava. So it's a nice name. It's an interesting allusion to the story, but it clearly is not what it is. And the city falls, the temple is destroyed, but we still have a remnant that stays behind, and that's the story of Gedaliah, which we will save for next time. Okay, do we have questions? Do we have comments? Let's see.
Wait, who killed
story about Wadi Kelt?
Who
Nebuchadnezzar.
He came
the
back.
Babylonians. The Babylonians capture him. We have this very powerful medrash that I brought there in Rashi. I didn't read it. That the Babylonian soldiers don't know what happened to Tzidkiyahu, but they see a gazelle that's running. And they're young guys. They want a little sport. So they chase the gazelle, they're hunting it. And by the time they catch the gazelle stops. They catch him at the exit of this secret passageway that Miyahu has escaped out of, and that's how he's falls into the hands of the Babylonians. So that's the midrash. But in the text, it just says he's caught by them. Right? There's a story about Wadi Kelt in the biography of Shar Yashuv. His father nearly died until a Bedouin passed by and saved him. Okay, thank you. Other questions, other comments? Very few questions this time. What's
You're
going
me,
on, guys?
Next week about this, because you
Yeah.
said the next time, but the schedule, I think, says we're going to Pesach.
No. We have one more. Next time we're going to
good.
do Shivat Zion. We have one
Okay.
more. And after that, the following week, we will have a session about Pesach, and then we're done. Pesach.
Any plans for after Pesach?
At the moment, no, because there, God willing, will be real tourism, and I might not have time to do this, even though I love doing this. We'll see. We'll see. At the moment, we're taking a little break. Why
And
would the king build? What?
Miyahu, as far as his death. I mean, how far after?
Yirmiyahu we'll talk about when we talk about Gedalia. So I'm
Okay.
going to save that for next time.
Mhm.
Okay. I have a question here. Why would the kings build palaces in Ramat Rachel? So that's an interesting question. Assuming that it really is Judean palace complex, which I said is question now. But the king often would have a nice place to escape a little bit, right? You want to have a place, first of all, it's on the main road. It's important you'll be able to see what's coming to Jerusalem, but you also might want to get out of the city a little bit. Ramat Rachel, high up, nice air, very good place to build your summer palace, right? It's something that kings definitely did, that they didn't have only one palace. Other questions, other comments?
Thanks, Shabbat Shalom. I'll have to listen to it without all the Hafsakot Chashmal that I had.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right.
Not your
Shabbat
fault.
Shalom, everybody.
Just excellent. Thank you
What was
so
that?
much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. I will see you guys next week when we will be in the same daylight savings time together.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Stay well.
Bye. Be well.
Have a good rest with the time change.
Less rest, less stress.
Let's rest.